The rain was falling hard on the empty road, and Jake held the steering wheel tightly as his old truck made its way through the storm, with the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance and water splashing up from the wheels every time he drove through a puddle. Jake was a single dad trying to get home to his little daughter Lily, who was waiting for him with warm soup and a smile that always made his heart feel full even on the worst days. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds, and the wind was howling like it was angry at the world. Jake turned on the wipers and leaned forward, squinting through the blurry windshield when something up ahead caught his eye. There was a figure on the side of the road, almost invisible in the rain and shadows. A person walking slowly and looking lost and broken. Jake frowned and slowed down his truck. As he got closer, he saw her more clearly, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a young woman in a white dress that was torn and muddy and clinging to her like it had been through a storm of its own. Her long hair was soaked and hanging over her face, and her arms were wrapped around herself, as if she was freezing. Jake passed her and drove a little farther, but something inside him told him to stop. He looked at the empty seat beside him, then at the baby seat in the back, where Lily usually sat. Then he looked in the mirror at the woman, now getting smaller in the rain. He pulled over and hit the brakes hard enough to make the truck skid a little. He reversed slowly until he was beside her again and rolled down the window. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm even though he could feel a strange tightness in his chest. The woman didn't answer. She looked at him with wide eyes full of fear and sadness, and something else he couldn't quite understand. Her lips were trembling, and she took a small step back, as if unsure whether to run or stay. Jake held up one hand like a peace sign and said, "I don't mean any harm, just want to help. It's cold, and you're soaking wet." Still she said nothing. Jake looked down the road and then back at her. There was no car, no suitcase, no bag, nothing at all. Just her standing there like a ghost from a dream. "You need a ride?" he asked, again softer this time. The woman looked down at the ground, then up at the sky, then at him. Finally, she gave a small nod and walked slowly to the passenger side. Jake reached over and unlocked the door, and she opened it and climbed in without a word. She sat very still with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her eyes staring straight ahead. Jake glanced at her, unsure of what to say. He could see now that she was younger than he thought, maybe in her 20s, and her face, though pale, was beautiful in a quiet way. The dress she wore looked like something out of a fancy party, or maybe even a wedding, and it was torn near the bottom and stained with mud. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently as he started driving again. No answer. "Where are you headed?" he tried again. Still no answer. He didn't want to push her, so he just kept driving and turned the heater up a little. The silence in the truck was loud but not uncomfortable. Jake's mind was racing with questions, but he knew better than to ask too many at once. He looked at her hands resting in her lap and noticed they were red from the cold and shaking slightly. He reached behind his seat and pulled out an old blanket from when Lily was a baby and handed it to her. She looked at it, then at him, and took it slowly, with both hands or fingers brushing his for a moment, before she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, almost too quiet to hear. It was the first word she had spoken. Jake smiled a little and nodded, even though she wasn't looking at him. He felt a strange mix of worry and protectiveness toward this quiet stranger sitting in his truck on a rainy night. As they drove, the storm grew stronger, and the wipers struggled to keep up with the rain. Jake looked at her again and saw that she was now holding something small and shiny in her lap. It looked like a ring box, dark red and velvet. She held it tightly, like it was the only thing she had left in the world. Jake didn't ask. Not yet. He knew there was a story behind her silence and her torn dress, and that box she was holding like a secret. And deep inside, he knew that tonight was just the beginning of something bigger than he ever expected. The rain still poured as Jake's truck rolled slowly down the wet road, and the wipers moved back and forth like the ticking of a silent clock that made the night feel slower and heavier. The woman sat beside him in the passenger seat, her dress still damp and her eyes staring out the window without blinking, as if her thoughts were far away from here, maybe miles away, maybe years away. Jake kept glancing at her, then back at the road, then at her again, trying to understand what kind of pain could turn someone so quiet, so afraid, and so lost. She still held that little red velvet box in her lap, her fingers wrapped around it so tightly that her knuckles looked white. Jake thought about asking her again where she was going or what her name was, but he didn't want to scare her more, and something inside him said this wasn't the kind of story you could rush. After a few minutes, he turned down a quieter road leading away from the highway and toward his small town, where his little girl Lily was still waiting for him, probably watching cartoons with her blanket on the couch and waiting for his hug. He thought of calling home to let her know he was bringing someone, but then he remembered he had left his phone charging on the kitchen table next to Lily's half-eaten apple. The truck's heater blew warm air through the vents, and the windows began to fog just a little as the storm outside raged louder. Jake cracked one window to let out the fog, and that's when he heard it, a small sound of voice so soft it could have been the wind. She said something. He turned down the radio and looked at her. "What did you say?" he asked gently. She kept looking out the window, but spoke again, just a little louder. "You shouldn't have stopped for me," she said. Jake was surprised not by her words, but by how sad they sounded, as if she believed trouble followed her like a shadow she could never outrun. He said quietly, "I couldn't leave you there alone, not in this storm." She finally turned her head and looked at him, her eyes big and tired and full of something he couldn't name. "You don't know who I am," she said, "and you don't know what I'm running from." Jake nodded a little and said, "That may be true, but you look like someone who needed help, and I've taught my daughter to always help people when you can." At the mention of his daughter, her face softened just a little, and she asked, "How old is she?" Jake smiled, the first real smile in a while, and said, "She's 6, smart as a whip, and full of questions. She'll probably ask you a million things when we walk in the door." The woman looked down at the box in her lap and slowly opened it with shaky hands. Inside was a diamond ring bigger than anything Jake had ever seen, shiny and perfect and glowing even in the dim light of the truck. Jake's eyes widened, but he said nothing. She looked at the ring, then closed the box and held it tighter than before. "I was supposed to wear it today," she said, almost like she was talking to herself more than to him. Jake waited. She took a breath and said, "My name is Emily, and I ran away from my wedding this morning." Jake didn't know what to say, so he kept driving, letting the wheels and the rain and the quiet fill the space between them. Emily kept talking slowly, like each word was heavier than the last. "He's rich beyond anything I've ever known," she said, "and powerful. Two people do what he says because they're afraid to say no, and I was going to marry him not because I loved him, but because I was scared to say no too." She looked down again, and her voice cracked as she said, "I felt like I was disappearing piece by piece, and today when I looked in the mirror in that big white dress, I didn't see myself anymore. So I ran." Jake listened without interrupting and felt a strange twist in his chest, not just because of her story, but because he could see how much it hurt her to say it out loud. "You did the brave thing," he said, "not the easy thing, but the right thing." Emily shook her head and wiped her face with the corner of the blanket. "He's going to look for me," she whispered. "He's not the kind of man who lets things go." Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel and said, "Well, he's not going to find you tonight, not while you're in my truck." Emily looked at him, and for the first time she smiled, just a little, not a big smile, not a happy smile, but the kind of smile that says maybe there's still hope left somewhere. As they drove farther into the night, the lights of the small town began to appear in the distance, glowing warm and soft like stars close enough to touch. And for the first time since the storm began, Jake felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The truck rolled into town as the rain began to slow, and the clouds started to move away like curtains opening after a long and heavy play. The streets were quiet, and the lamps cast soft yellow light on the wet roads, making everything look calm and peaceful like a painting after a storm. Emily leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing slow and deep, like she was trying to find a place in her mind where she could rest. Jake glanced at her, then looked ahead and turned onto a street, a small row of cozy houses with porches and potted plants and fences that needed a little paint. At the end was his house, small but warm, with lights still glowing in the living room. He parked the truck and said softly, "We're here." Emily opened her eyes and looked at the house, and for a moment her face changed a little, not in fear or sadness, but in something like disbelief, like she hadn't seen a place that felt safe in a long time. Jake stepped out and walked around to open the door for her, holding out his hand in the soft light. Emily hesitated, then took his hand and stepped down, her bare feet touching the wet gravel as she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. They walked up to the porch together, and Jake unlocked the door and opened it slowly. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like soup and something sweet, maybe apples or cinnamon. Daddy, Lily shouted from the couch, jumping up and running toward him with her arms wide and her socks sliding on the floor. Jake laughed and picked her up, spinning her once before holding her close. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you too," he said, and then looked over at Emily, who stood quietly near the door. "This is Emily," he said gently. "She's staying with us tonight." Lily looked at her with big, curious eyes and then smiled wide and said, "Hi, I'm Lily. Do you want soup? My daddy makes really good soup." Emily gave a tiny smile and nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake led her to the couch and brought her a towel and a pair of warm socks from the laundry basket and poured her a bowl of soup that steamed softly in the quiet room. She sat with the blanket over her shoulders and the towel in her lap as she sipped the soup, and for the first time in hours, she looked like she could finally breathe. Jake sat across from her with Lily beside him and said softly, "If you feel ready, you can tell me more. If not, that's okay too." Emily looked at the spoon in her hand, then at Lily, who was now drawing something with crayons on a piece of paper. Then she took a deep breath and began to speak. "His name is Thomas," she said. "He owns hotels and planes and buildings in different countries, and everyone always said how lucky I was to be with him. But they didn't see what I saw," she said. "They didn't see how he treated people when no one was watching, or how he spoke to me when I asked questions or made small mistakes." She looked up at Jake, her eyes shining, but not from tears, from something deeper, maybe truth, maybe courage. "He didn't hit me," she said, "not with his hands, but he made me feel small every day. He made me feel like I was a piece of his property, like a painting or a car or a trophy. I tried to leave once before," she said, "and he told me if I ever tried again, he would ruin my life and my family's too. So I stayed and smiled in photos and wore pretty dresses and told myself maybe one day it would get better." Jake listened without saying a word, his hands folded and his heart heavy with anger and sorrow for what she had been through. "And then this morning," she said, "I looked at myself in the mirror with that big dress and shiny ring and makeup I didn't choose, and I didn't recognize the woman in the reflection. So I waited until the makeup artist left and the house got quiet, and I climbed out the back window and ran and kept running until my feet hurt and my dress tore and the rain came and I didn't know where I was anymore. Then I saw your truck, and I thought maybe, just maybe, someone kind would stop." Jake swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "I'm glad I did," he said. Emily looked at him and then at Lily, who was now asleep with a crayon still in her hand and a picture of a house and 3 stick figures drawn on the paper. One had brown hair like Jake, one had a ponytail like Lily, and one had a big dress like Emily. She smiled again, but this time it reached her eyes. "You have a beautiful daughter," she said. Jake smiled and said, "And she has a kind heart just like her mom did." They sat in the quiet living room with the soft sound of rain still tapping the windows and the storm slowly fading behind them. Emily held the velvet box in her hands once more, but now it looked smaller, somehow, not because it changed, but because she had. The next morning came slowly with the soft light of the sun peeking through the window curtains and the quiet sounds of birds in the trees outside, like a calm after the storm. Emily opened her eyes, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then she saw the soft couch, the folded blanket, and the little girl asleep on the rug beside her, and she remembered. She sat up slowly, her dress still wrinkled from the night before, and her hair falling gently around her shoulders as the quiet warmth of the house settled in her chest like something she hadn't felt in a long time. Jake was already in the kitchen making toast and eggs and coffee that filled the air with a smell that made everything feel real. He looked over and smiled when he saw her awake. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked while pouring juice into a small cup for Lily. Emily nodded and said, "Yes, better than I have in weeks." Lily yawned and stretched, then smiled at Emily like they had always known each other and said, "I drew you another picture." She held up a new drawing with 3 people standing under a big tree and a sun smiling in the sky. Emily smiled back and said, "I love it, thank you." After breakfast, Jake gave Emily a clean sweater and jeans that used to belong to his sister, and showed her the bathroom down the hall. She took a long shower, letting the warm water wash away the fear and the cold and the dirt, and when she looked in the mirror afterward, she saw something different. Not weakness, not shame, but maybe strength, maybe a spark. When she stepped out wearing the soft clothes and her damp hair tied back, Lily clapped and said, "You look like a superhero." Emily laughed softly for the first time since she could remember and said, "You're sweet." They spent the rest of the morning playing with crayons and blocks, while Jake cleaned the truck and checked his mailbox outside. Everything felt simple and quiet and peaceful, until Lily looked out the window and said something that made the air feel heavy again. "Daddy," she said softly, "there's a man looking at our house." Jake froze and walked to the window, slowly peeking through the curtain. Across the street, a black car was parked with its engine running, and a man in a dark suit stood beside it holding a phone and staring toward their front porch. Jake's heart began to pound as he stepped away from the window and looked at Emily. "Do you know him?" he asked. Emily came over slowly and looked out, then covered her mouth with one hand as her face turned pale. "That's one of his men," she whispered. "He's here." Jake locked the door and pulled the curtains closed, then looked at Lily, who was now holding Emily's hand tightly. "It's okay," Jake said calmly. "We're safe here. No one's coming in." Emily stepped back and began pacing, her fingers shaking and her voice trembling. "He found me," she said. I knew he wouldn't stop." Jake stood in front of her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Listen to me," he said. "You are not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not letting anyone hurt you." Emily looked up at him, her eyes full of fear and something like trust. The car across the street didn't move, and the man didn't leave. He just stood there watching like a shadow, waiting for night. Jake walked outside slowly and stood on the porch, arms crossed, his face calm but firm. The man looked at him and smiled a little, then raised his phone and snapped a photo before getting back into the car and driving off without a word. Jake came back inside and locked the door again. He turned to Emily and said, "I don't know what that was about, but I don't like it." Emily nodded and sat down on the couch with her hands still shaking as Lily climbed into her lap without a word and rested her head on her shoulder. "What do we do now?" Emily asked softly. Jake looked at both of them, then walked to the closet and pulled out an old box with emergency cash, his sister's spare phone, and a small notebook with numbers he hadn't called in years. "We make a plan," he said. "We call the right people, and we do this the smart way." Emily looked at him with wide eyes full of fear and gratitude. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Jake knelt beside her and said, "I don't need to know everything to know what's right." Lily looked up and said, "Daddy is strong, and he's good, and we're like superheroes, right, Emily?" Emily smiled weakly and said, "Yes, I think we are." Outside, the sun was shining now, but shadows still lingered in the quiet corners of the street. And though the storm had passed, something darker had just begun. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the sidewalk outside, while inside the house Emily sat holding Lily close, her eyes still watching the front door like it might open at any moment. Jake was by the window, looking out through a narrow crack in the curtain, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in a low voice to someone he hadn't called in years, a friend who once worked in private security and owed Jake a favor. He told his friend everything in simple words, and his friend listened without interrupting, then said he would send someone to check the neighborhood and call back in an hour. Jake thanked him and hung up, then walked over to Emily and said quietly, "Help is coming, but we need to stay alert." Emily nodded and clutched the little velvet ring box, still tucked in the pocket of her borrowed sweater. They waited as the minutes crawled by, and the silence inside the house felt thick like fog. Then came the knock. It was sharp and cold, like the sound of a fist that never asks but demands. Jake froze, and so did Emily and Lily. He stepped toward the door and called out, "Who is it?" A deep voice answered through the door, "Calm down, sir. We just want to speak with the woman who came here last night. She left something important behind." Jake's eyes narrowed, and he looked at Emily, who was already shaking, her head, her lips pressed tight, her hands gripping Lily's shoulders. Jake turned the lock and opened the door just a crack enough to see the man in the dark suit from earlier, standing there with a thin smile on his face and a phone in his hand. Behind him was the same black car, engine, running door open, like a snake ready to strike. Jake said she's not coming out, and I don't care what she left behind. The man's smile stayed, but his eyes grew cold. This is a private matter, sir, he said, and you're getting involved in something you do not understand. Jake stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him just enough to keep Emily and Lily safe inside. I understand plenty, he said. She ran because she was scared, and I'm not about to let you drag her back into that. The man stepped closer, his voice lower now, but sharp like glass. You think you're protecting her, but she belongs to someone who doesn't lose and doesn't forget. Jake clenched his fists and said she's not property, she's a person, and if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. The man chuckled and said, go ahead, make the call, but by the time they show up, she'll be gone. Jake didn't flinch. He stared straight into the man's eyes and said, if you try anything, I swear you'll regret it. The man paused just long enough for the silence to feel like thunder. Then he leaned in and said, she's making a mistake. She doesn't know what's good for her. Then he stepped back and got into the car, slamming the door shut. As the car pulled away, Jake stood on the porch, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He turned and went back inside, where Emily stood frozen, her face pale, her arms around Lily like a shield. Jake locked the door and said, it's okay, he's gone for now. Emily sat down slowly, still shaking, still gripping the ring box that now felt heavier than ever. I should have known he would send someone. So soon, she whispered. He always said he had eyes everywhere. Jake knelt beside her and said, look, we can go to the police. We can get a restraining order. I know it's scary, but we can't let him keep scaring you. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and pain, but also something new, something like fire. Do you really think they'll help? She asked. He has money. He has power. He always gets what he wants. Jake said, maybe he does, but not today, not here, not while I'm standing between him and you. Lily looked up at Emily and said, you're safe now. My daddy is strong like a lion. Emily smiled just a little and hugged Lily close as tears ran down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered to Jake, her voice full of something real, something raw. He nodded and said, we'll get through this one step at a time. You're not alone anymore. Outside, the sky began to darken again, but this time it wasn't a storm, it was the weight of what was coming. Inside the house, the lights glowed warm and steady like hope refusing to go out. And though the man in the suit was gone, for now, Jake knew the fight was far from over. The night was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the kind that holds its breath, waiting to see what happens next. Emily sat by the window, watching the trees move in the wind, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea that Jake had made for her just before Lily went to bed. The little girl had fallen asleep in Emily's arms while they read a story about brave princesses and clever foxes and magic that lived in the hearts of kind people. Jake sat on the couch nearby, the same blanket over his lap, his eyes fixed on the front door like it might open any second, even though he knew it probably wouldn't tonight. He had made calls earlier and filed a report with the police, who promised to send someone by in the morning, and his old friend had also called back to say he was arranging legal help and would come down the next day. Everything was moving forward slowly but surely, and yet the fear still lingered like fog that refused to lift. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft and steady like the first light of day after a long storm. I don't want to keep running, she said. I'm tired of hiding. I want to fight back. Jake looked at her and saw something strong in her eyes, not the fear from before, not the pain, but something new, something rising. You don't have to do it alone, he said. We'll face it together. Emily looked down at the velvet box, still resting on the table. Beside her, the ring inside had not moved, but it no longer seemed to have power over her. She picked it up, opened it, and stared at the shining stone one last time before closing it again and whispering, I'm done with this life, it's not mine anymore. Jake reached over and placed his hand gently on hers and nodded. The next morning came with golden lights spilling through the curtains and birds singing like a quiet promise. Lily woke up with a big stretch and sleepy eyes, then smiled when she saw Emily already up making breakfast with Jake in the kitchen. You smell like pancakes, she said happily, and ran to hug them both. They ate together like a family, even if they weren't one by name yet, and the house was filled with something new, something warm. Later that day, they drove to the police station where Emily signed papers and told her story to a kind officer who listened carefully and took notes and gave her a small card with the words "Restraining Order Request" printed on it. Jake stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand when her voice shook and standing behind her like a quiet shield. They also visited a local lawyer recommended by Jake's friend who promised to help her for free and explained the steps they would take to keep her safe and begin again. That night they returned home and sat outside on the porch watching the stars appear one by one in the sky. Emily turned to Jake and said, "You think it's really over?" Jake looked at her and said, "I think the worst part is over and the rest is just healing and growing." Emily smiled, then looked at Lily, who was chasing fireflies in the yard, her laugh filling the air like music. "She's happy here," Emily said. "She makes it feel like home." Jake nodded and said, "You're happy here too, aren't you?" Emily didn't answer with words. She just leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. The next few weeks passed with slow changes, but all of them good. Emily started helping at Lily's school, reading stories to the class and painting colorful murals on the walls. She found a part-time job at a local bakery where the owner welcomed her like family and told her she made the softest bread he had ever tasted. She even found a small apartment just a few blocks away from Jake and Lily where she could live safely and still be close to the people who had helped her when she had nothing. Every evening she would visit for dinner or take Lily to the park or help Jake with his garden that always seemed to grow better when she was around. One afternoon, while watering the flowers, Jake looked at her and said, "I think Lily wants you to stay forever." Emily laughed and said, "What about you?" Jake smiled and said, "I think I already knew the answer." As the sun set behind the trees and the sky turned gold and purple and soft orange, Emily looked around at everything she had now and everything she had left behind. She no longer saw fear when she looked in the mirror. She saw someone who had run and fallen and stood up again. Someone who had found love not in diamonds or power, but in kindness and safety and in second chances. And though the journey was long and the road hard, she knew now she had reached something beautiful. A new beginning.